When we think of Adolf Hitler, images of dictatorship, war, and genocide immediately come to mind. But few are aware that behind the chilling speeches and brutal decisions was a man heavily medicated, often by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. Among the cocktail of drugs prescribed to him, one substance stands out for its dark and disturbing implications: cocaine. Yes, the Führer of Nazi Germany was a regular user of cocaine, administered as a nasal and throat treatment. This wasn't casual experimentation. It was a calculated, medically endorsed regimen that may have influenced his mental decline and the catastrophic decisions he made. Exploring Hitler's cocaine use isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a window into his psyche during one of history's darkest periods. By examining how addiction shaped his leadership, we gain new insight into the monstrous acts of a man spiraling into delusion and paranoia. To really understand Hitler's cocaine use, we have to look at what was happening in Nazi Germany at that time. Believe it or not, drugs were everywhere. The German military gave soldiers pills called Pervitin, basically meth, to keep them awake and energized during long missions. Even ordinary people, like housewives and factory workers, were encouraged to take it to stay productive. The idea was that drugs could help the country stay strong and efficient. So, when Hitler started using drugs, it wasn't totally out of place. His personal doctor, Theodor Morell, gave him dozens of medications. These included vitamins, hormones, painkillers, and yes, cocaine. At first, it was used to treat problems with Hitler's sinuses and throat, sprayed directly into his nose and mouth. But this wasn't just about fixing medical issues. Over time, Hitler started relying more and more on these drugs. He trusted Morell completely and never questioned the treatments. What began as simple remedies slowly turned into a dangerous routine of drug use, one that may have had serious effects on his mind and decisions as a leader. Hitler's cocaine use wasn't a wild party drug situation. It came in the form of medical treatments. Dr. Theodor Morell, who became his personal doctor in the mid-1930s, began giving him a mixture of drugs for everything from stomach problems to colds. Among these was a cocaine-based nasal spray and throat treatment. It was prescribed to help Hitler breathe and speak more clearly, especially before public appearances. But the problem with cocaine, even when used for medical reasons, is that it can quickly become addictive. Morell's notes show that Hitler used the cocaine spray frequently and combined it with other drugs like amphetamines and opiates. It's not hard to imagine how this cocktail affected his mind. Historians and doctors looking at Hitler's health records believe that these drugs might have played a big role in his behavior. He became more paranoid, more anxious, and more disconnected from reality as the war went on. Some reports describe wild mood swings, long, rambling speeches, and sudden bursts of rage, signs that are often linked to heavy drug use. He was also known to have shaking hands and an odd gait, which may have been side effects of the drug mixture in his system. By the last years of World War II, Hitler was isolated in his bunker, relying on daily injections and pills. His mental state was deteriorating quickly. While we can't say that cocaine alone made him paranoid and delusional, it likely pushed an already unstable personality even further over the edge. In short, the cocaine wasn't just treating a sore throat. It may have been feeding the darkest parts of his personality, making him even more dangerous and unpredictable. As the war dragged on and Hitler's drug use continued, people around him started noticing big changes in his behavior. He was no longer the strong, confident leader from the early days of the Nazi regime. Instead, he became increasingly paranoid, withdrawn, and unpredictable. Many of his closest officers described him as acting strangely, staring into space for long periods, snapping into sudden rages, or mumbling to himself. His decision-making also took a turn for the worse. Historians believe that some of Hitler's most disastrous military orders, like refusing to allow retreat in hopeless battles or moving troops based on fantasy rather than facts, were influenced by his declining mental state. These decisions didn't just lose battles, they cost thousands of lives and sped up the collapse of Nazi Germany. There are also reports of him lashing out at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and constantly fearing conspiracies. Some believe these were signs of drug-fueled delusions made worse by the stress of losing the war. He became obsessed with controlling every detail, trusting almost no one, and locking himself away in his underground bunker. People close to Hitler, including his staff and military leaders, found it harder and harder to reason with him. His judgment was clouded, his emotions were unstable, and he was surrounded by yes-men who were either too afraid or too loyal to challenge him. The drugs, especially the mix of cocaine and other stimulants, likely made it impossible for him to see reality clearly. By the end, Hitler was not just a dictator at war. He was a man whose mind and body were breaking down, and his drug use played a big role in that downfall. By the final weeks of World War II, Hitler was a shadow of his former self, isolated, exhausted, and deeply paranoid. Trapped in his Berlin bunker with Soviet forces closing in, he could no longer rely on Dr. Morell's full supply of medications. This sudden withdrawal from his daily drug cocktail, including cocaine, likely made his mental and physical state even worse. Cocaine withdrawal can cause intense depression, confusion, and anxiety, all symptoms Hitler seemed to display. Combined with the overwhelming reality of Germany's defeat, his mind may have simply shut down. Reports from inside the bunker describe a man who barely ate, who trembled constantly, and who ranted about betrayal and destruction. Historians debate whether it was the drugs, the war, or his own delusions that pushed Hitler to take his own life. Most agree, though, that the end was a mix of military collapse and personal unraveling. The loss of his drug routine, especially the substances that had kept him going for years, likely played a key part. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. It was the end of a brutal regime, and possibly the final act of a man driven to madness, in part by his own drug dependence. Not everyone agrees on just how much drugs like cocaine affected Hitler's behavior. Some historians, like Norman Ohler, argue that drugs were a major part of his leadership and helped explain many of his decisions. Ohler's book, Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich, became very popular for showing just how deep drug use went in Nazi Germany, especially with Hitler himself. But other experts say we need to be careful. They argue that blaming drugs for Hitler's actions might take attention away from his beliefs, his ideology, and the system he built. After all, millions of people followed him, not because he was high, but because they believed in what he said or feared what he might do. There's also some debate about how strong the evidence is. Most of what we know comes from Dr. Morell's records, which are detailed, but also hard to fully confirm. Some historians worry that focusing too much on the drug angle oversimplifies a very complex person and time in history. Still, even critics admit that Hitler's drug use was unusual and troubling. Whether it was the main cause of his downfall or just one part of it, it's a subject that continues to spark debate and demand attention. Adolf Hitler's cocaine use is more than just a shocking footnote in history. It offers a disturbing look into how drugs may have fed his darkest traits, from medical treatments that turned into addiction to wild behavior that influenced life and death decisions. The role of substances like cocaine adds another layer to understanding how one man led a nation into disaster. While drugs weren't the only factor, his ideology, ambition, and cruelty were already well in place. They may have worsened his paranoia, clouded his judgment, and sped up his collapse. In the final days of his life, cut off from his drug supply and watching his empire fall apart, Hitler's mind seemed to spiral even faster. Studying this side of Hitler isn't about making excuses. It's about understanding how dangerous a mix of power, belief, and chemical dependence can become, especially when the consequences affect millions of lives.